by a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Pagan. Hello and welcome to The Crooked Path. In case you hadn't realised, I'm Peter Pagan. And this week we're going to be looking at the different witchcraft traditions that are out there. It's going to be a fairly meandering exploration of just what different flavours of witchery there are out in the big wide world, and especially here in the good old US. First of all, I just wanted to share a little bit of news with you. You may remember that we recently released Mama Star Casas's old style conjure cards, the standard deck, which is a regular playing card size. Very nice, selling very well, by the way. Well, probably at the end of this week we will finally get to make available the deluxe set, and this has got the larger tarot card sized deck, and it also comes with a 108-page book on how to use them, some anointing oil, a candle holder, and a white cotton reading cloth, so that you have something pristine to lay your cards down upon. And it all comes in this nice little limited edition box as well. So I just wanted to share that with you because I'm very excited. So, let's talk about some lore, shall we? So as I said at the beginning, we're going to take a look at traditional witchcraft and some of the different traditions. Now obviously there's a lot of different flavours out there in the big wide world. There's some that are specific to the UK, some that are specific to the US, and some that you'll find just about anywhere. And just to remind you, there are several different traditions of Wicca out there as well. There's Wicca and traditional witchcraft, and Wicca itself, British traditional Wicca, which is generally considered to be Alexandrian Gardnerian, and I can't remember what the third one is in the US, but in England it's just Alexandrian Gardnerian. Over here there's one or two others that get added to the mix, but these are initiatory traditions that generally stem directly or indirectly from Gerald Gardner. And then there's an awful lot of Wiccan traditions that have popped up around the world in the last 40-50 years that are quite unique. I know myself, I had the interesting experience of discovering Buddhist Wicca from some people from Japan. The Japanese seem to really like Wicca, and they mix it and match it with just about everything. So there's Shinto Wicca, there's Buddhist Wicca, they do Welsh, Druidic, Japanese Wicca, and you name it. They just seem to have a fascination with the subject. Traditional witchcraft, for those of you who haven't been paying attention to this podcast for very long, is essentially witchcraft of a non-Wiccan flavour. Some of the traditions predate Gardner's Wicca, some of them are recreations of earlier paths, and some of them are just reconstructions that are modern but are based upon classical writings and history and law. And you will find that there is a flavour for everybody. Wiccans generally follow the reed, and it harm none, do as thou wilt. Traditional witches generally don't, and both sides will make big noises about the fact that they do or don't follow that, because it's generally a bone of contention, especially when you have people in the media saying that all witches follow the reed, because it ain't true, for one thing. But then if you've been listening to my podcasts for long enough, you'll already know that, and you'll know, as usual, I am very opinionated, but you know, that's okay. There are some regional variations. You get Cornish witchcraft, or the Pellars. You get Welsh witchcraft, or the Welsh wizards, who are known as the Gwython, in Wales at least. You're not allowed to be a Gwython if you're not in Wales, because it's all very land oriented. And there's various forms of Scottish and very English witchcraft as well. English witchcraft has a lot more tea involved, so I'm told. But you know, that's there's always going to be some interesting variations there. Some of the groups that you'll find wandering around that are specific to the United States, there's a lot of influence from Conjure, Hoodoo, Powwow, and Native American and the African religions, and consequently you'll find a lot of Conjure-based or Hoodoo-based crafting going on as well. Our friend Orion Foxwood, as well as doing his fairy seership, is also founder of the Temple of Foxwood, which is the traditional witchcraft tradition, and he's also got standing in the Alexandrian Wicca, which often surprises a lot of people. And then of course there's groups like Cultus Sabati, which tend to be international, and sort of they put out a lot of books, very expensive books. People like collecting them, people like selling them after they've read them, because they tend to sell second-hand for way more than they cost originally. But there's a lot out there, and really I think I'm not the best person to discuss that, because there are some people in the community who are not only very familiar with the history of the craft as it's developed in modern times, but have hands-on experience. So we're going to have a nice little conversation with Ann and Dave Finnin. Are we back?
We're back.
I'm getting carried away. I'm having way too much fun. So, Ann and Dave Finnin, the magister and maid of Roebuck tradition. You also have Gardnerian initiations, and trained or worked with or got up to extreme mischief with just about everybody who was anyone in the pagan scene over here in the
We have
US.
our fingers in a lot of pies.
Yeah. So maybe we can start off with you introducing what the Roebuck's all about, as it is obviously a tradition.
All right. Well, the Roebuck is a group started out of desperation when our original initiatory tradition, which was Mosian, broke apart, and we're left on our own to develop from the materials we were given.
Mm-hmm.
So we threw it together, and Anne wrote a delightful book called The Forge of Tubal Cain, put out by a certain publisher we know, which details how you build a tradition, how you train people, and so forth. That I recommend.
The book was a bit of a swan song. We had put it together to show that when traditions are put together, and nearly all modern traditions are put together, pieced together, as Dion Fortune once said, from shards of old pottery that you dig up out of a mound somewhere, and there's a process of reassembling them and making them work, and it's an arduous process. It doesn't happen overnight, and you don't dig a tradition out of peat bog somewhere. It's developed over time, and I wanted to let folk know who may be delusional enough to try to do it on their own some of the pitfalls and the difficulties that happen when you try to reassemble a tradition from old pieces and make it work in the modern world.
And of course, despite your best efforts, some people don't pay attention and go ahead and try anyway.
Well, and some people are delusional, just like we were back in the day.
Uh-huh.
And may the goddess bless them, everyone, because without them, everything would sort of grind to a screeching halt, and we'd end up being, like the Catholic Church. So new traditions must be developed and adapted and changed, and they grow like plants. They as soon as they seed and die, then the seeds grow into something else.
Well, actually, speaking of Southern California, we know that the craft traditions in California were generally started based on the Alexandrian workings, because the first covens working in Southern California were Alexandrians. It wasn't until the 1970s you had your first Gardnerian coven in Southern California operating. And the Fred and Martha Adler were the ones that spread a lot of influences around, and they initiated Bill and Helen Mose. So we found that in our own first initiation tradition was the Mosian. It was influenced heavily by the Alexandrian. Give it a bit of foundation.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Because of course then of course along came Ed Fitch.
Well, Ed Fitch, the story behind that was Ed was a Gardnerian, third-degree Gardnerian along Island Line, which was directly...
Does that mean they use iced tea for that?
Yeah, well, they use a lot of other things too, we found out. But that's a whole nother podcast. But he was also initiated by Raymond Buckland, who was the one who brought the tradition to America from England. And the problem that Ed had when he moved out to Southern California is that according to the Long Island rules and regulations, a man could not set up a Gardnerian circle without...
Initiation circle.
Without a third-degree Gardnerian priestess. Well, he didn't have one. And so he started a series of training covens where he would teach students, Dave and myself included back in the day, basically what has been termed Witchcraft, which was it
was outer court.
an outer court, slightly romanticized version of Gardnerian craft, where people would learn how to cast circles and work in a circle and do spells and things without being part of official oath-bound Gardnerian practices. And he would gleefully initiate people into two outer court traditions, or initiations, and they'd go blithely off and start another coven with the information that they were given. These were not bona fide Gardnerian covens.
Well, let me explain something. What you had in the 60s, you had a lot of people clamoring for information about witchcraft, the Gardnerian tradition, and so forth. And Ed took it upon himself to write the what we would call the Outer Court Book of Shadows and the Outer Court and the Gomorrah of the Outer Short.
Grimoire Shadows.
Gomorrah Shadows, which is another Outer Court reference for training. And these were non-oath-bound, non-copyrighted. And for a organization known as the Pagan Way, these were spread hither and yon and everywhere else. And many traditions, the basis of it, roots of it, came from these two books.
There were three people who actually contributed to the Pagan Way material. Ed was, of course, one of them. There was also a fellow by the name of John Hanson, who was in the Midwest somewhere, who added an awful lot of the Alexandrian ceremonial magic information to it. And another gentleman by the name of Joseph B. Wilson, who is another thread that ties us to the traditional witchcraft end of it.
I was just digging the files, so I want to correct you on something.
What?
the Outer Book Book
Yeah,
of Shadows and the Gomorrah were both written by Ed.
right.
The Pagan Way material was added to by John Hanson at Joel's.
But it became a corpus of stuff that you could write to Ed or Joe, courtesy of a small publication called The Waxing Moon, which came out quarterly, I believe, whenever Joe got around to it. And you could write to a P.O. box and you could request this stuff, and you got a stack of mimeographed papers about so. And it was, you had all of the Sabbath rituals, you had spells, you had initiation rituals, you had hand fastings, whatevers. So it was possible to run a coven with the outer court Pagan Way material, and many people did.
The thing is, this stuff was neither oath-bound or an actual tradition, you know. It was not copyrighted. So this stuff, people interested in starting their own witchcraft traditions would take this stuff, put it in the cupboard, and tell their people that were with them, look what I found in my grandmother's papers.
Yes, my grandmother's papers.
Which was
I got
the basis
my
of many
tradition
of
from
the
my
traditions.
grandmother. Well, we decided this was absolutely histrionical, and we started calling Ed Grandma Ed, because his material ended up being the material that everybody got from their grandmother. And we literally had people come to see us, and when we showed them the material, they would look at it, oh, so-and-so said that was from his grandmother, and so we figured, you know, it was everybody's grandmother. But it was not so much a deliberate, in many cases it wasn't a deliberate lie. It was, none of this stuff had a byline. None of it had any kind of notation as to who wrote it and when. And after several generations of a coven, where the high priestess would initiate somebody and they'd take over the material and go off and form their own coven and all of this, after 2 or 3 generations, it was possible they had no idea where it came from.
Unless, of course, they come across the official published version of some of it, and they saw the name Herman Slater on it.
Yes, well, that was another problem. Herman Slater.
Herman did not write it, but regardless.
Herman Slater literally
He did
stole
published it.
He published it because the material was not copyrighted. It had no byline, and he picked it up and decided that he was going to publish it under his name, and there it was for a long time. So if you go to a used occult bookstore, you might just find the Book of Pagan Way,
Or Book of Pagan Rituals.
Book of Pagan Rituals, or whatever it's called,
Yes.
under the byline of Herman Slater, and that is not Herman Slater's material. That is in Pitch's.
It seems that the dissemination of copyright-free material seems to be a theme in the development of American paganism. Because isn't that what happened with the Cochrane papers?
Yes,
as
that's
well?
what happened with Cochrane writings, and part of that was a reaction against the pedigreed Gardnerians who basically hoarded their Book of Shadows like some sort of holy writ.
And I do need to point out for any of our UK listeners and viewers, it's actually to the point where they actually talk about having puppy papers.
Oh, absolutely.
You need to have documentation of your lineage.
It gets worse. What Ed told us one time was that Long Island, which was a coven, and I want to make clear here that this was not something that they learned from across the pond. This is something that the Long Island group, who were descended from Ray Buckland, wanted to preserve their lineage by making it kind of high church. And you could only have a copy of the official Gardnerian Book of Shadows if you were one of their initiates. And what Ed told us one time, which we thought was hysterical, not just puppy papers, but there was a book, a spiral notebook that somebody had in their archives that had full-length nude pictures of every single third-degree Gardnerian priestess that was descended from the Long Island line. So that if anybody had any doubts about whom was whom, they could look it up in this binder and make sure that the high priestess in question was so listed. And it was, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but it made one of those wonderful stories. that you
I
tell
should
people.
mention that things of time have passed. There's been a couple generations since then.
Yes, this was in the
And
early 70s.
The European and UK and the rest of the world and the Long Island line, the American Gardnerians, now are freely exchanging information and laughing at some of their own
Well,
people
and
set years ago. So it's this was some historical quirks which people realize now were quirks and.
And to
Not-
be fair, the Long Island folk that had gotten their tradition from overseas were very concerned about the wannabes and the people who would, get a copy of Ed Fitch's book and claim to be, Gardnerians when they really weren't. So they were trying to basically set up who was a real initiate of the Gardnerian line and who wasn't. And it got out of hand because they were being terribly exclusive.
Well, there was a reason for it too, and that was the fact that there was a social and political movement going on in the 70s, early 70s, that, shall we say, forced the Long Island Gardnerians to be very strict about the rules because they did not want certain aspects of the craft movement claiming that they ran the movement.
Mhm.
And for various reasons, because of the way such as some of these people were acting and so forth, they did not want to encourage it.
And to be honest, I think there was some people in the UK weren't particularly helpful. I remember when I first got going as an Alexandrian back in the early 80s, there was a coven that shall remain nameless that lived just outside Heathrow, adjacent to the Heathrow airport, who would charge large sums of money for Americans to fly over for the weekend,
Absolutely.
get all 3 Gardnerian degrees and fly back again.
Well, there was the Long Island group was doing that too. So.
No, the Long Island never charged for initiation.
No, they never charged, but they were flying people out to.
They were
Long
doing
Island for
what Gerald Gardner had done himself, and that is a fact. Gerald, one of the things he wanted is he recreated the witchcraft religion, Wicca, because before he stepped in the late 40s, early 50s, there was no real general movement of it. It was there in folk traditions and things like this, some family traditions in various forms, but nothing really well established. And he wanted to see the movement grow, so he would basically, anyone who was willing to learn, he was willing to give them the boost to get up, and he figured if he did this often enough with enough people, the traditions would survive.
Mhm.
And that proved to be right. Obviously, when you do that, you make a lot of mistakes too, but still you had a lot of good people who were attracted
And
to
even
it.
now, you have many Gardnerian lines that descend from several very talented and powerful high priestesses that Gerald initiated, and they have, from what we've been able to discover, they have kept things as pure as they can.
Mhm.
Well, I'll give you an example, because this is public information, I'm not breaking the oaths. Gerald Gardner had several priestesses. One was Owen, Lady Owen, who was the one that initiated Ray Buckland and brought the tradition over the United States in the 60s, early 60s. Our own, which was Whitecroft, the result of Ray Bone initiating Arthur and Maggie, who the people that started the Whitecroft line. And we're very, very, very happy to have made a connection with that and been brought into that one.
It was useful to us as people who have been in the craft for long decades before we got to that point, to just find out what real, true British Gardnerian witchcraft really was, and not some of the the adaptations
Yes.
that
Well,
we
plus
found
the
here.
fact, and one thing that people don't realize, and we didn't know to the true extent till we went over to England and started doing it, was the amount of communication and intermixing of the various pagan and things going on. Bill Gray, William Gray, he worked with many groups, was friendly a lot of the different craft circles, and was a guest at many of them.
He was a
Roy
friend of,
Bowers,
he was
or
a friend
otherwise
of Doreen
Robert-
Valiente's.
as a
of
Robert
all
Cochrane
people.
was initiated Garnerian. We found that out, and for a while there people disagreed, didn't believe us, but it's been published, and Doreen's writings are becoming more well-known, and she mentions the covens he was at.
So there was a lot of well, that was the same way here.
Yeah.
That there was an awful lot of cross-pollination between Alexandrian groups and Gardnerian groups, and anybody who wanted to set up a coven and do initiations and whatever, and they received an awful lot of genuine, useful information. What they didn't get was the lineage. They didn't get the puppy papers, they didn't get the pat on the head saying, you are now part of this tradition. So you had groups that sort of popped up like mushrooms with no connection to each other or to any established tradition. And but if they made it work, then there are people that are 4 and 5 generations of these
One thing I
covens.
should mention, right now, at the present time, I'm on a couple lists which are exclusively dedicated to traditional groups, Wicca, and we've now got Garnerians from as far away as Australia, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Scotland, that's a foreign country, UK, United States, and several other places I can't even keep up in my mind right now, all communicate with each other on these lists.
Mm-hmm.
So information and way people do things is being exchanged very rapidly nowadays, unlike anything that happened 20 or 30 years ago.
Although 20 or 30 years ago, well, a little longer than 20 or 30, sort of in the early times for the pagan community over here, I mean, you were talking about information being passed on without lineage, but you, if I'm not mistaken, one of the main things that seemed to be passed around was the Cochrane papers.
Yes.
And that kind of got treated like a tradition in spite of itself.
Well, the Cochrane papers, let's face it, you're basically talking about 6 letters which Joe had received from Roy Bowers, Robert Cochrane. Another 4 which were written to Nigel, not Nigel,
Norman Giles.
Norman Giles. And that was all it is. It was not a traditional, just a bit of, these letters referred to philosophy of a tradition.
And lore.
And so forth, which Roy was working and developing.
But they certainly seem to get spread far and wide and influence an awful
Well,
lot.
they-
Part of that was because Joe was spreading them around just like Ed spread around the Pagan Way stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You write to the waxing moon and you get the stuff. It was also included in the Books of Shadows of a lot of groups that had ties to Joe Wilson. The Mosean group, the Mosean Book of Shadows, had a whole bunch of Cochrane stuff in it because
Well, to
Joe
have
had-
what Cochrane material there was, as I said, there wasn't a huge amount of it.
but it was there, and people were looking at it going, what is this? This is interesting, and piecing it all together. The Bill and Helen Mose had worked with Joe Wilson when they all lived in Kansas City or someplace back in Minnesota,
Yes.
back in the late 60s, early 70s. And they had ties to Fred and Martha Adler's Alexandrian coven. But anybody associated with Joe ended up with the Cochrane papers because that was what Joe did. He was very adept at gleaning the good stuff from whatever he ended up picking up from here and there and thither and yon in his travels, and he'd pass it along to whoever was working with him. None of this stuff was oath-bound, none of it was copyrighted, none of it even had a byline. There are people who have the copyrighted material word for word in their books of shadows and have no clue where it came from.
Well, as the priestess that found the Witchcraft tradition, Maggie, said, we're all magpies, we all pick up stuff
Well, yeah.
along the way.
It was, they were very much aware that they were picking up shards and piecing together old pottery.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever worked, whatever fit, they used. One thing we did discover in our dealings with the British Gardnerians as opposed to the American Gardnerians, they didn't hoard their Book of Shadows like some kind of holy writ, to the point where they were not permitted to change even so much as a comma or a period. There were some typos that they had in the Long Island book that they were not allowed to correct because it would have altered the holy writ.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's funny, I didn't think that we were the people of the book.
that's the problem, is that in the late 60s, early 70s, the Long Island crowd in particular were people of the book, because that was their holy book, and it dated back from the Middle Ages, and somebody had dug it out of a peat bog, and it was not to be changed one iota.
Well, no, the official rules were you could add but not delete.
Yeah,
You could always add and
and you
delete.
couldn't change anything once it was there. And I still remember years ago we had our archetypical Long Island Gardnerian third degree high priestess who was in the Roebuck for a while. And there was a part of the Gardnerian Beltane rite. Oh, do not tell the priest of our art, for he would call it sin. But we will be in the woods tonight, a conjuring summer in. We had to inform her that was a Kipling poem. She thought it was one of those, ordained of olds from the Middle Ages. Another funny that illustrates that. In the late 60s, early 70s, there was a young woman who published a book through Llewellyn, who should know better, but Weschke kind of didn't at the time, called Lady Sheba's Book of Shadows.
Oh, yes.
Well, her claim was that, again, this was an old family tradition. She had gotten it from her grandmother. Well, one of the poems in said Lady Sheba's Book of Shadows was Darksome Night and Shining Moon, Harvey Villages, etc., which was copyrighted by one Doreen Valiente. And apparently Weschke had published this thing without any kind of byline or attribute on this. And Doreen got a hold of it and proceeded to sue for infringement of copyright, and she won. Apparently, Jessie Bell, who was Lady Sheba, had received this material in the mail from someone she was corresponding with at the time, and published it as her family traditional Book of Shadows.
Nice.
And it caused all sorts of kerfuffle when they found out that basically it was a version of the Gardnerian Book of Shadows from England, and that it had all of Doreen's poetry. No attributes, no bylines, no giving her credit, none of that.
And boys and girls, you may understand at this point why it is that in my coven we refuse to make any claims of any lineage or any standing with anybody, because it's just easier that way.
Well, and certainly there's been a lot of people who have...
Oh, we haven't seen what he's got in his cover.
No!
Well, I'm sure there's bits and pieces he picked up from us, at least I hope so.
The magpie tradition.
I hate to think we're ignored.
But...
You are duly represented.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. But that was the way things were. Is that if the Gardnerians were not going to be forthcoming with whatever they had, then people just make stuff up, which they did a lot.
Let's see, how many different groups or traditions can we think of in Southern California? We had the Sea Coven.
Yeah, well,
We had the, let's see.
there were at least,
Church of Eternal Source.
that was not a Wicked Coven.
That was a pagan though.
It was pagan.
Uh,
But anyway, that basically all over the country was like this, is that people would get a hold of a corpus of stuff and start running a group with no training, no bona fides from anybody else,
Mm-hmm.
and literally not knowing where their stuff came from. And if their high priestess or high priest had told them it was, dug up out of a peat bog somewhere, they believed it.
There's also, I mean, allow me to put this gently and delicately. You've seen a lot of history in this field.
yeah.
I know.
Yes.
It seems to me that you very much get the flavour of the month club or trends in groups. For example, when I first came here from the UK 16 years ago, the big excitement was everyone was fam trad.
Yes.
Everyone had been initiated by their grandmother. Everyone had an unbroken tradition that their family had practiced for millennia.
And the reason for that was because they were people that didn't get initiated into the local Gardnerian coven for one reason or another. These were the Joe Wilson type of folks who were outcasts or iconoclasts or just basically people that didn't want to, toe the Gardnerian lion, and they were perfectly capable and in some cases were just as inspired as anybody else, and they could literally start their own tradition, and did.
I should point out historically, you arrived 16 years ago. When Ann and I got into this in the early 70s, the groups were very much reflected traditional Wicca, and it was always initiatory. It was mostly the 3-degree system, and had at least 1 or 2 generations of covens with the same tradition in it around them. And this went on until about the end of the 70s, 75, 76, so forth. Another influence in the pagan movement came in, Dianic. This is when you were tying the women's movements and that in with Wicca, and wound up with that movement, adding a different flavor. And between that and some others, you wound up with a large group of what we call the eclectic tradition starting. And
If it's Tuesday, it must be ISIS.
And later, you were here for when the change went from what you saw 16 years ago to the more recently it's the instant witchcraft and so forth, with people just taking a little bit of A, B, and C and saying, that's it, they're not working.
There does seem to be a trend at the moment of the cult of the spell book,
Yes.
Well,
for want of a better description.
and part of that was a result of in the mid-90s of all of the TV and movie Charmed and some of that came out, that everybody wanted to do the woo-woo spellbook and candles stuff, but that is actually nothing new. There was a woman in Los Angeles, of all places, who had a certificate on her wall claiming to be the official witch of Los Angeles, which one of the mayors, I think it was Yorty.
It was Yorty.
Yorty, yeah. A mayor that my folks used to call Traveling Sam because he spent more time elsewhere than he did in his own city. But he decided this was going to be a Halloween prank. And Louise Huebner was a astrologer, psychic, what have you. And so he drew up this elaborate scroll making her the official witch of Los Angeles. Well, of course, she cashed in on that and wrote a couple of books. And basically all she had was regurgitation of standard, spell casting 101. But she had this, this official thingy from the mayor and all that. There was another a woman, again, a psychic and a porn actress that sort of blew through Los Angeles.
In which sense? Yes, we may need clarification on that.
Oh, wait,
Better be
Both?
sure, better, who's gonna pay for this, for soon there?
Good point, good point. It was purely
Well-
platonic.
If it hasn't been published with the name, don't go into
all right,
it.
anyway, she ran a shop, very popular shop down in West Hollywood. And apparently was very much a hub of a lot of wannabes that would go in and buy candles and herbs and stuff. And I guess they had classes or something and all of that. So that all happened. This was a woman who was not connected in any way with any kind of initiatory lineage of any tradition. She was a psychic and a show woman and someone who did the long black dress thing and had the shop and unfortunately she had a lot of people who came to her classes that would bop about and tell everybody that they were witches, and we'd say, "Oh, what tradition are you?" And they'd look at you, "Tradition." That kind of
Nice.
thing.
So, with the modern trend of, I mean, there's a lot of people out in the pagan community these days who not only turn their backs on the traditional hierarchy of the coven structure and even the concept of initiation, but they kind of could care less about the history as well. Where does that leave initiatory traditions, do you think, now?
Like any movement, you're going to have the outer court and the inner court. You're going to have the people who just want to buy a book and a black candle and go put a hex on their boyfriend. You're going to want the people who just want to dress up and go dance around a tree somewhere. This is nothing new. In fact, in the early 70s, we used to have what they called the groves, which were outer court groups where people would have like a Sabbath festival, like Beltane or something, out in a park, and they'd have a party and people would have food and stuff.
All three of us are associated with a phenomena which was very successful in California, and that is open rituals done usually in connection with a cult shop or something,
Yeah.
and people would just come to those open seasonals. They come all the time, but that's the level of commitment they wanted to make to
And you
actual
had
craft.
people coming to these when we were doing the grows out in the park. They would come to whatever was offered, and they'd stay and they'd party and all that. But what they didn't know is that the people from the initiatory groups, the traditional groups, would sort of prowl the perimeter and chat up the people who looked like they were serious. And that if somebody looked like they wanted to go farther, then you'd say, I'm in a group and we're going to have like a full moon, and if you want to come, let me know. It was strictly off the cuff. It was very informal. But if you wanted to join a coven, you just kept going to these outer court things until somebody tapped you. That was how you did it. You also knew people in science fiction community. There's a grain of truth that people used, that witch covens would recruit people from Dungeons and Dragons games. There is a small amount of truth to
Well,
that.
and in Southern California, a great many people were trying to do it from the Society for Reenactments, the medieval.
The medieval, or the people who worked the Renaissance fairs. They were the same people that would go to science fiction conventions and whatever, and you get to know people. You get to chatting with them on various occasions, and then you can kind of say, if you're really interested in this stuff, we're, this group I'm with, we've got this thing going. And now, of course, it's the internet. You have a web presence, and people will write in, and you know, you chat them up and see what they're about.
Well, the thing is, what you got now is a more experienced traditional Wicca groups with more people in there with more years as members of the circle. They don't always have people knocking their doors to learn and become initiates, but once they do are very faithful for the groups. And I think we're just ready to sort of a medium point in whether the increasing or decreasing, because it's always cyclical.
Yeah, it's cyclical, and it was trendy for a while, so everybody wanted to be into it. Now it's not as trendy as it used to be, and so
which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, it cycles. Another thing that's available now that wasn't available back in the day, and that is you've got a tremendous amount of information, not just on the internet, but published books and stuff where if somebody wanted to go on their own, they could. They had the material to do it. I've told our students on a couple of occasions that stack of papers like that. I said, you know, you have as much now that people swore oaths to get 20 years ago, because back in the day you didn't get that material unless you were initiated into a covenant and swore an oath. And you know, here it is. It's on the internet. You know.
Well, we had two people recently that the husband was already initiated of our group. The wife wanted to be, and their former teachers, they've retired, and we finished the training of the wife, and she was initiated, and they went to Missouri, I think. And whereas I used to give people a little stack of mimeograph papers, I now gave them an external hard drive with 30 or 40 gigabytes of information on it.
So whatever they wanted to do, they had the information to do it, and that's, I think.
Plus, you can call us too, but here's information to go through.
You can do that now where you couldn't back then.
Yeah.
So you really don't need to join a group to get the information. And there were an awful lot of people who joined groups just to get stuff. And now you can get the stuff without the initiation, which in some ways is good, because you know that the people who really are interested and really dedicated to a particular tradition, particular covenant, are there because they want to be.
So it's almost coming back full circle to the old days where witchcraft was a criminal offence, and so you knew when someone knocked at your door they meant it.
Yeah, or that's what oaths were, and that's what taking the measure was, and all of those other things, because you knew that if somebody was going to put their livelihood or their life on the line to join a coven, then they were going to take it seriously.
Yeah, well, things have slacked off. I can recall not too many years ago when we actually had people coming every week to a coven for their training and whatnot and so forth.
Oh, we still.
Then it broke down to twice a month, and then eventually one a month. You know, but
well,
I guess it's people have such busy lives these days.
That's another issue. There's so much distraction, and people have to work harder, and they have sometimes more than one job, and they have families and things like that. So there's a lot more distractions than there was, and for us, I think it's a good thing, because we have one daughter coven up in Ojai where everybody has little kids. So their coven meetings they have to do what churches do. They have to have somebody who watches the kids while everybody else is in the ritual.
Nice.
And we like it.
Although it's handy if you need baby fat.
Well, there's that too. But also these are children who are literally hereditary witches. They grow up in the circle. They grow up with the rituals. Was that
horrid and hairy, did you say?
Pardon?
Horrid and hairy?
Horrid and hairy. But that too. But so you get a generation of people that have grown up with this. This is their way of life, just like someone in the church would be.
So sort of looking to the future, just as we finish up. where do you see this all going for the pagan community generally, witches in general, and for yourselves as Roebuck?
Oh, I don't know. Every time.
I have to. We asked our friend and one of our people that was so much influence a lot of our things, Evan John Jones once. I got him on videotape by answering this. That very same question: where do you think it's going to go next? And he just said, it'll disappear and they'll go on to the next thing.
Well, I think like everything else, these things, they flower and they seed and then they die back and then they come again. It's not, it's a cyclical thing. I think that we have seeded, we have spread the seeds of something
So new
very important.
How,
But how it will end up sprouting and what it'll turn up as, who knows?
well, let's face it, every time we think we've reached a point where we're going to retire, somebody like our friend Ed, who we just saw last week, comes in with something new. He's got a group out in Texas who wants us to give our personal touch to. So,
Cool.
And
so
these-
that it's a case of, well, just when you think you're pretty much just sort of gliding along and you meet just the seasonals with your loyal members of your tradition and so forth,
just
somebody else throws
something
something at you.
well, and another thing that our lodge master, Pope Runyon, said at one point, these things migrate.
Mhm.
California pretty much is, not very conducive to a lot of this because everybody it's too easy
Mm-hmm.
and it's become too much of a recreational activity. But a lot of covens are starting to sprout up again, traditions are starting to sprout up again in other states.
Well, I
particularly
think
southern
what's
states.
happened is I came to California in the latter part of 1969. And at that time, California was a place where you came if you're optimistic about your future. You had the aircraft industry, you had the car industry. Lots of things were going on, a lot of manufacturing being going on, and things like that. Now, that sort of thing's happening in other states, and people are migrating away from California because they, frankly, have found it's been rather restricted to what you can or can't do here, and the opportunities are no longer where they were.
It's also in the LA area, Southern California, it's very difficult and it's crowded. If I have, for a while, I had 4 members of our coven down in the South Bay area.
Mm-hmm.
And it took them 2 hours to drive up for Circle. Not because it was a long way, but the traffic was so hideous
Mm-hmm.
that coming up, even on a weekend, for Circle, they had to sit in traffic for an hour in order to get here. When we go down to visit them, because they have host circles every now and again, and we have to drive sometimes as much as an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
That chews up an awful lot of time and effort and energy, and if you have small children or if you have a very demanding job, it makes it difficult. So I think what we're going to do in Southern California anyway is I think you're going to kind of pull in the tentacles a bit, and you're going to have the traditional covens, but they're not going to be as obvious as they used to be. And maybe we'll go back to one of these situations where we have the open groups or the open circles that are, the party and the dance around the tree and whatever else.
Well, there's also the
and
other
then they can
factor
choose.
too, and as a fact, unlike when we were in our 20s or 30s or even our 40s, we're now reached the point where we need sticks and sometimes walkers, sometimes we aren't moving at all, and suffering a lot of physical challenges which we didn't face when we were much younger, so it's a little harder now.
Yeah, it's harder and it takes more time and energy, and if you have people who aren't willing to pull their weight in a circle, then you just, you don't have the backup
Mhm.
anymore. And it's the people that are running the covens, they're not lasting more than 3 or 4 years. It's hard work.
Yes.
Well, that used to be
And-
the norm anyway, but a lot of, most
Except for the
covens didn't
insane
last
ones, you
about
get
5
some kind of.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm speaking of people like me, that kind of insane.
Well-
I think we're being invaded.
But
one of the things though that I've noticed about covens and people like you and people like us and
The crazy
the crazy ones, there's an oomph, there's an otherworld oomph, where we've got gas in our tank from somewhere.
mhm.
And when that gas runs out, we just coast to a halt, and that's the end of it. And we've watched people do it when they're that connection,
Mhm.
that spiritual gasoline runs out. And you
So in
never,
other words, make the most of us while we're still able.
because we're getting old, folks. And
Speak for yourself, Sonny.
Hey, look, you gotta realize that, I mean, we just hosted Ed for, at our place for an overnighter just a few days ago, and
he's
I mean, I keep
75.
reminding, he's 75, almost
Oh, wow.
76. So, you know, you realize, no, he's no longer in his 30s like he was when I
Mhm.
first
Yeah.
met him.
He's still going strong, but he's 75.
Well, I think it's safe to say, and I'm just going to wrap up now because we've probably gone a lot longer than I planned, but it was so much fun that I didn't want to stop, to be honest. But
You're all the worst of it.
yes, but with the police knocking on the door, we probably have to wrap up now before they arrest us. Otherwise, that could get very embarrassing. But ultimately, there is a lot of choice out there. There's the Pagans, the people who do it for the social scene and the parties. There are the people who do it because they want to learn all the cool spell of the weeks and all that sort of thing. And there are people who want to dive headfirst into the mysteries and get lost in the labyrinth.
Okay, now the one thing I'd like to say before you end this,
Mhm.
that if you're interested in a traditional Wicca group, always get a vouch. In other words, somebody claims to be such a tradition, so forth,
Get a
check
second
around.
opinion.
Yeah.
Find out for sure if they're legitimate or not, because there's too many posers out there.
And remember, sometimes a negative recommendation can actually be a good recommendation
Yes.
as well.
Yes. When you're disliked by all the right people.
It's a bit like Hollywood. It doesn't matter what they're saying about you as long as they're talking about you. Well, thank you both very much
Well,
for
thank you
taking
for
the time.
having
I
us,
know you
Peter.
came down at very short notice at great distance and
Absolutely.
personal cost. But, I'm sure we'll have you on again because it's always fun. And I will look forward to our next adventures together.
All right.
All right, thank you, Peter, for
Thank you.
inviting us.
So thanks everybody, hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to coming up with something crazy for you next week. Take care.
By a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Pagan.